EVO. Where's the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where's the knowledge that we have lost in information? Welcome back to The Devil Within. This is the next installment of The New Monsters. Episode 2 of Montauk. Last time we stood on a lonely stretch of Long Island shoreline beside a creature that had already begun decomposing long before anyone thought to photograph it. Within hours, those photographs would spread across the internet with astonishing speed, and before a single zoologist had been given an opportunity to examine the carcass, millions of people had already reached a conclusion. They weren't asking what species had washed ashore. They were asking what laboratory it had escaped from. It's an extraordinary leap of logic when you stop and think about it. A dead animal appears on a beach, and almost instinctively, a modern society concludes that somewhere nearby the government has created something that it can no longer control. Medieval Europe blamed dragons, colonial America blamed witches, 21st century America blames classified research facilities. The monsters have changed, but the instinct remains exactly the same. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this new season of The Devil Within, I'd appreciate it if you take just a moment and follow the show wherever you're listening right now. It costs you nothing, and it helps the show immensely. And it ensures that these stories will continue finding the people who enjoy exploring the strange intersection where history, psychology, and folklore meet. And if you'd like to watch every episode, complete with archival photographs or maps, sometimes visual companions, you'll find us on the EVO Creative YouTube channel. By the end of today's episode, you'll understand why an abandoned military installation overlooking the Atlantic became one of the most mythologized places in America, and why one small island just offshore transformed an ordinary dead animal into one of the greatest modern cryptids ever created. Because before anyone believed in the Montauk Monster, first they had to believe in Montauk. Chapter 1. The Places We Can't Enter. Every civilization creates forbidden places. The Egyptians buried their kings inside chambers sealed beneath thousands of tons of limestone, convinced that eternity itself depended upon no authorized hand disturbing what had been placed inside. Medieval Europe surrounded monasteries, castles, and royal archives with walls that divided ordinary life from privileged knowledge, reinforcing the comforting notion that the most important things in the world were accessible only to a chosen few. The 20th century merely exchanged stone walls for chain-link fences and concrete bunkers and security checkpoints. Sure, the architecture changed, but human curiosity didn't. And there is, maybe, no objective more effective at stimulating the imagination than a locked gate. The gate itself possesses no mystery at all. Steel is just steel. A padlock is nothing more than shaped metal performing the task for which it was designed. But the moment someone erects a barrier across a road that was once open, the landscape on the other side begins to transform immediately. Ordinary buildings become much more important than they were. Routine work becomes classified. Empty hallways start acquiring whispered histories that they never possessed while they were occupied. Human beings have always struggled to accept the possibility that nothing remarkable lies behind a closed door. If we're denied an explanation, we instinctively begin writing one ourselves. And Montauk sits at the perfect intersection of geography and psychology. Drive east from Manhattan several hours and the world changes so gradually that the transformation is almost impossible to notice in real time. The suburbs surrender to vineyards and golf courses, and then those give way to marshes and wind-shaped pines. Expensive homes become increasingly scattered until they finally yield to fishing boats and weathered old bait shops and stretches of coastline that seem remarkably untouched, considering one of the largest cities on the planet is only a few hours behind you. And by the time you reach the Montauk Lighthouse, there's nowhere farther east to drive. The continent simply ends at your feet. And standing there, with nothing ahead except the Atlantic Ocean, you begin to understand why the military considered this place invaluable. Because long before satellites circled the Earth or radar dishes became commonplace, coastlines represented the nation's earliest warning system. Whoever controlled the eastern approaches to New York Harbor possessed a tremendous strategic advantage. During the Second World War, when German submarines operated with alarming effectiveness along the Atlantic seaboard, that advantage became impossible to ignore. The federal government transformed Montauk into one component of a much larger defensive network, constructing coastal artillery batteries capable of engaging enemy warships long before they reached the harbor itself. Soldiers arrived, roads expanded, concrete bunkers disappeared beneath carefully engineered hillsides. Observation towers punctuated the bluffs overlooking the sea. It was really a remarkable engineering accomplishment built for a war that, thankfully, never reached our shores. History, however, has a way of refusing to remain still. Because before the concrete had fully aged beneath that salt air, the Second World War yielded to an entirely different conflict, one in which oceans no longer guaranteed safety, because enemy aircraft can cross continents in a matter of hours. America found herself confronting an adversary that might never be seen until the moment it appeared overhead, carrying weapons capable of erasing cities. The response required a different kind of fortress. Instead of enormous coastal guns, America began constructing eyes. Camp Hero emerged during those anxious early decades of the Cold War as part of an immense continental radar network whose purpose was both astonishingly ambitious and profoundly simple: detect Soviet bombers before they reached North American airspace. Towering radar antennas rotated day and night above the bluffs, sweeping invisible pulses across the Atlantic while technicians worked below ground, interpreting signals that most civilians would never know existed. Information flowed continuously into larger command systems, linking installations across the continent, each station contributing a few additional minutes of warning should the unthinkable ever occur. To the men stationed there, Camp Hero was neither mysterious or supernatural. It was a workplace. Long shifts unfolded beneath fluorescent lights inside reinforced concrete structures filled with humming electronics, glowing radar scopes, and the constant mechanical rhythm of equipment performing exactly as designed. The greatest compliment a radar operator could receive was monotony. A shift of work in which nothing unusual appeared on the screen was evidence that the system had succeeded. Viewed from outside the fence, however, the installation presented an entirely different picture. Visitors could see that enormous radar tower dominating the skyline like some unfinished cathedral dedicated to technology. They could glimpse reinforced bunkers disappearing beneath grassy hillsides and roads leading toward buildings marked only by warning signs and security gates. They could watch military vehicles come and go without ever learning what occurred inside. The installation became, quite unintentionally, a perfect machine for manufacturing speculation. It's worth remembering that secrecy itself isn't sinister. Every nation protects certain information during times of war and times of peace. Military installations exist precisely because some technologies can't function if every detail becomes public knowledge. But secrecy produces an unintended consequence that governments have never fully mastered. Information may be classified, but curiosity can't be. Every unanswered question becomes an invitation, and every restricted landscape eventually attracts stories capable of filling the silence official explanations leave behind. Camp Hero might have remained nothing more than an abandoned Cold War relic had history ended there. But it didn't. Visible from Montauk's shoreline, especially on clear days when the Atlantic seems almost unnaturally calm, lies Plum Island. Small enough to appear almost insignificant against the horizon, it nevertheless occupies an outsized place in the American imagination. As stated in the last episode, since 1954, the island has housed a federal lab devoted to studying dangerous animal diseases. Research essential to protecting American agriculture from outbreaks capable of devastating our livestock populations. That much is thoroughly documented. And the island's isolation made it an ideal location for this work. But laboratories devoted to dangerous diseases are by necessity inaccessible to the public, Sure, people could see the island, they just couldn't go there. And as history's demonstrated, time and again, the shortest distance between a locked gate and a conspiracy theory is measured in imagination. Chapter 2. The Story That Escaped. There's an old observation, usually attributed to Mark Twain, that history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Whether Twain actually wrote those words is almost beside the point. The words survive because they describe something fundamental about the way human beings understand the world. We inherit the fears of previous generations. We translate them into the language of our own time, and then we convince ourselves we've discovered something entirely new. And that's exactly what happened at Montauk. The actual military history of Camp Hero is remarkably well documented. Its radar systems, underground operations, and role within America's Cold War air defense network have been studied by historians for decades. Visitors can still walk through the grounds today, exploring many of the concrete structures that remain, while the Great Radar Tower continues to dominate the landscape exactly as it did half a century ago. The mystery begins only after the historical record grows silent, and it's within that silence that another story slowly assembled itself. There weren't any government archives or declassified reports that were made available, so that story came to the public through books, through lectures, through interviews, late-night conspiracy radio programs, and eventually the boundless imagination of the internet. And like many modern myths, it began with a single voice. In 1992, Preston Nichols and Peter Moon published The Montauk Project, Experiments in Time. And the book presented an astonishing narrative. Nichols claimed that beneath Camp Hero lay a labyrinth of hidden laboratories where secret government scientists had conducted extraordinary experiments involving mind control, psychic research, electromagnetic manipulation, and even time travel. According to the story, the work represented the continuation of earlier clandestine programs stretching back through MKUltra and further still to the legendary Philadelphia experiment, a naval tale that had already occupied the strange borderland between science fiction and conspiracy for almost 40 years. Now, it's important to pause here because this is where history and folklore begin walking side by side. There is no credible documentary evidence that the Montauk Project described by Nichols ever even existed. Historians have found no government records supporting claims of psychic experimentation beneath Camp Hero, no engineering plans revealing hidden underground complexes devoted to impossible research, and no witnesses whose testimony has been independently corroborated. Okay, the extraordinary claims remain exactly that, just claims. But dismissing them entirely misses the far more interesting question. Why did so many people find them believable? And to start getting to the answer, you don't need Montauk. You just need to look at America's own documented history. During the 20th century, the federal government carried out genuine, classified programs that remained unknown to the public for years. Intelligence agencies experimented with LSD and behavior modification during MKUltra. We've gone over that. Military researchers explored unconventional technologies. Entire projects remained hidden beneath layers of classification until long after those projects had ended. Most never assembled the fantastic accounts described by Nichols, but they established something, maybe even more significant than that. They demonstrated, simply, that secrecy was real. And once people discover that governments have concealed some things, it becomes much easier to imagine that they've concealed everything. Montauk occupied the perfect psychological landscape for that leap. Camp Hero stood abandoned, its purpose no longer obvious to casual visitors. Plum Island remained visible across the water, inaccessible behind federal security. Massive radar towers rose above forests like relics from another civilization. The physical evidence existed. Only the interpretation remained uncertain. Human beings have never been particularly comfortable with uncertainty. We're pattern-seeking creatures. Presented with disconnected facts, we instinctively begin arranging them into narratives. The abandoned base, the restricted lab, the Cold War, the classified research, the strange carcass that appeared decades later. All of these pieces seem to belong together, right? Whether they actually did is irrelevant. The story worked because it satisfied something deeper than evidence. It offered coherence. And coherence is extraordinarily persuasive. By the late 1990s, the Montauk Project had escaped the pages of Nichols' books and entered popular culture. Television documentaries explored the legend with varying degrees of skepticism. Internet forums dissected every alleged witness account. Amateur investigators photographed abandoned tunnels and rusting equipment and sealed doors, convinced that somewhere beneath the visible structures lay another installation waiting to be discovered. Every unanswered question became proof that still larger questions remained unanswered. The mythology no longer required confirmation. It had become self-sustaining. Then fiction entered the conversation. When Matt and Ross Duffer first developed the series that would eventually become Stranger Things, they didn't originally imagine the story unfolding in Hawkins, Indiana, remember. Their earliest concept carried the title Montauk. The setting was chosen because the place itself already possessed an atmosphere unlike almost anywhere else in America other than Area 51. A lonely coastline, an abandoned military installation, government secrecy, rumors of strange experiments on an island. It contained every ingredient necessary for a story about ordinary people discovering something extraordinary hidden beneath familiar ground. Production, as we said, moved to Georgia, and the fictional town of Hawkins replaced Montauk, but the DNA of the original concept remained unmistakable. The laboratory survived, experiments survived, even the central idea that scientific ambition might outrun ethical constraint, that survived. In an unexpected twist, fiction accomplished something that history never could. Millions of viewers encountered Stranger Things, became fascinated by its fictional laboratory, and then searched for the place that had inspired it. And they found photographs of Camp Hero. They discovered Plum Island. They encountered the Montauk Project legend for the first time, often without realizing where documented history ended and modern folklore began. And boom, the feedback loop was complete. Reality inspired fiction, fiction revived folklore. Folklore sent people back to reality, searching for proof that had never been there in the first place. So the monster no longer required a laboratory. The story itself had become the equipment. And once an idea reaches that point, it becomes almost impossible to contain. And once an idea reaches that point, it becomes almost impossible to contain. The devil within this has never been the bunker. It's never been the radar tower standing watch over the Atlantic, or the laboratory visible across the water, or even the extraordinary claims that eventually gathered around all of it. That's just the scenery. They're the stage upon which a much older drama continues to unfold. The real story is what happens when trust begins to erode. History teaches us that governments sometimes keep legitimate secrets. They build weapons in silence. They conduct classified research, and they conceal technologies until the moment they're ready to reveal them, or until history forces them into the open. But most of those secrets are far more ordinary than the public would imagine. They're constrained by budgets and bureaucracy, engineering limitations, and the often disappointing reality that institutions are usually less competent than conspiracy theories would require them to be. But every genuine secret leaves behind a shadow. And inside that shadow, speculation can flourish. The human mind has always preferred an elegant explanation over an incomplete one. Faced with abandoned military installations, inaccessible islands, and decades of Cold War secrecy, many people did what human beings have always done. They connected scattered points until they became a picture. Whether the picture reflected reality became secondary. It explained the uncertainty, and uncertainty has always been one of humanity's greatest discomforts. And maybe that's why the Montauk Project endures, while countless verified historical events quietly disappear from public memory. Facts ask to be understood. Myths ask to be believed. And those are two very different invitations. Every civilization invents monsters worthy of its own age. The ancient world feared dragons because vast portions of the earth remained unexplored. Medieval Europe feared witches because disease and madness arrived without explanation. The Industrial Revolution imagined creations that turned against their creators, from Frankenstein's laboratory to runaway machines. And modern America fears something different. We fear classified facilities, government compounds, corporate labs, artificial intelligence. Technology's advancing faster than ethics can keep pace. The Montauk Monster tells us remarkably little about biology, but it tells us an extraordinary amount about ourselves. By the time that strange carcass appeared on a Long Island beach, Americans had already spent decades learning that governments sometimes keep secrets. Most of those secrets were entirely real. Others were imagined. The difficulty, and probably the danger, lies in deciding where one ends and the other begins. The creature may never have escaped from a lab, but the idea certainly escaped from our imagination. And once it did, there was no putting it back. Next time on The Devil Within, we bring the story to its inevitable conclusion. The Montauk Monster wasn't simply born from one photograph. It was born from a nation that had slowly learned to distrust its own institutions. We'll explore the very real government programs that remained hidden for years, examine why those revelations changed the way Americans think about secrecy forever, and ask a question that reaches far beyond Montauk. What happens when trust dies? Because once people stop believing official explanations, they don't stop believing. They just begin believing something else. Join me next time for the conclusion of Montauk, here on The Devil Within. The Devil Within is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Branden Morgan.